The Cosmic Express by Jack Williamson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The Cosmic Express. This story was first published in Amazing Stories, November 1930. Mr. Eric Stokes Harding tumbled out of the rumpled bedclothing, a striking slender figure in purple striped pajamas. He smiled fondly across to the other of the twin beds, where Nada, his pretty bride, lay quiet beneath light silk covers. With a groan he stood up and began a series of fantastic bending exercises, but after a few half-hearted movements he gave it up and walked through an open door into a small bright room, its walls covered with bookcases, and also with scientific appliances that would have been strange to the man of 4 or 5 centuries before, when the age of aviation was beginning. Yawning, Mr. Eric Stokes Harding stood before the great open window, staring out. Below him was a wide park-like space, green with emerald lawns and bright with flowering plants. 200 yards across it rose an immense pyramidal building, an artistic structure, gleaming with white marble and bright metal, striped with the verdure of terraced roof gardens, its slender peak rising to help support the gray, steel-ribbed glass roof above. Beyond, the park stretched away in illimitable vistas, broken with the graceful columned buildings that held up the great glass roof. Above the glass, over this New York of 2432 A.D., a freezing blizzard was sweeping. But small concern was that to the lightly clad man at the window, who was inhaling deeply the fragrant air from the plants below, air kept winter and summer exactly at 20 degrees centigrade. With another yawn, Mr. Eric Stokes Harding turned back to the room, which was bright with the rich golden light that poured in from the suspended globes of the cold atoll light that illuminated the snow-covered city. With a distasteful grimace, he seated himself before a broad, paper-littered desk, sat a few minutes leaning back, with his hands clasped behind his head. At last he straightened reluctantly, slid a small typewriter out of its drawer, and began pecking at it impatiently. For Mr. Eric Stokes Harding was an author. There was a whole shelf of his books on the wall, in bright jackets, red and blue and green, that brought a thrill of pleasure to the young novelist's heart when he looked up from his clattering machine. He wrote thrilling action romances, as his enthusiastic publishers and television directors said, of ages past when men were men, red-blooded heroes responding vigorously to the stirring passions of primordial life. He was impartial as to the source of his thrills, provided they were distant enough from modern civilization. His hero was likely to be an ape-man roaring through the jungle, with a bloody rock in one hand and a beautiful girl in the other, or a cowboy, hard riding, hard shooting, the vanishing hero of the ancient ranches, or a man marooned with a lovely woman on a desert South Sea island. His heroes were invariably strong, fearless, resourceful fellows who could handle a club on equal terms with a caveman, or call science to aid them in defending a beautiful mate from the terrors of desolate wilderness. And 100 million read Eric's novels and watched the dramatization of them on the television screens. They thrilled at the simple, romantic lives his heroes led, paid him handsome royalties, and subconsciously shared his opinion that civilization had taken all the best from the life of man. Eric had settled down to the artistic satisfaction of describing the sensuous delights of his hero in the roasted marrow bones of a dead mammoth, when the pretty woman in the other room stirred, and presently came tripping into the study, gay and vivacious, and, as her husband of a few months most justly thought, altogether beautiful in a bright silk dressing-gown. Recklessly, he slammed the machine back into its place and resolved to forget that his next red-blooded action thriller was due in the publisher's office at the end of the month. He sprang up to kiss his wife, held her embraced for a long, happy moment, and then they went, hand in hand, to the side of the room and punched a series of buttons on a panel. A simple way of ordering breakfast sent up the automatic shaft from the kitchens below. Nada Stokes-Harding was also an author. She wrote poems, back to nature stuff, simple lyrics of the sea, of sunsets, of bird songs, of bright flowers and warm winds, of thrilling communion with nature and growing things. Men read her poems and called her a genius. Even though the whole world had grown up into a city, the birds were extinct, there were no wildflowers, and no one had time to bother about sunsets. "Eric, darling," she said, "isn't it terrible to be cooped up here in this little flat away from the things we both love?" "Yes, dear. Civilization has ruined the world. If we could only have lived 1,000 years ago, when life was simple and natural, when men hunted and killed their meat instead of drinking synthetic stuff, when men still had the joys of conflict instead of living under glass like hothouse flowers. If we could only go somewhere." "There isn't anywhere to go. I write about the West, Africa, South Sea Islands, but they were all filled up 200 years ago. Pleasure resorts, sanatoriums, cities, factories. If only we lived on Venus. I was listening to a lecture on the television last night. The speaker said that the planet Venus is younger than the Earth, that it has not cooled so much. It has a thick, cloudy atmosphere and low, rainy forests. There's simple, elemental life there, like Earth had before civilization ruined it. Yes, Kinsley, with his new infrared ray telescope that penetrates the cloud layers of the planet, proved that Venus rotates in about the same period as Earth, and it must be much like Earth 1,000,000 years ago." "Eric, I wonder if we could go there. It would be so thrilling to begin life like the characters in your stories, to get away from this hateful civilization and live natural lives. Maybe a rocket?" The young author's eyes were glowing. He skipped across the floor, seized Nada, kissed her ecstatically. "Splendid! Think of hunting in the virgin forest, of bringing the game home to you, but I'm afraid there is no way. Wait! The Cosmic Express." "The Cosmic Express? A new invention, just perfected a few weeks ago, I understand, by Ludwig von der Waals, the German physicist." "I quit bothering about science. It has ruined nature, filled the world with silly artificial people doing silly artificial things." "But this is quite remarkable, dear. A new way to travel, by ether." "By ether?" "Yes. You know, of course, that energy and matter are interchangeable terms. Both are simply etheric vibration of different sorts." "Of course, that's elementary," she smiled proudly. "I can give you examples even of the change. The disintegration of the radium atom, making helium and lead and energy. And Millikan's old proof that his cosmic ray is generated when particles of electricity are united to form an atom." "Fine. I thought you said you weren't a scientist." He glowed with pride. "But the method in the new Cosmic Express is simply to convert the matter to be carried into power, send it out as a radiant beam, and focus the beam to convert it back into atoms at the destination." "But the amount of energy must be terrific." "It is. You know short waves carry more energy than long ones. The express ray is an electromagnetic vibration of frequency far higher than that of even the cosmic ray, and correspondingly more powerful and more penetrating." The girl frowned, running slim fingers through golden brown hair. "But I don't see how they get any recognizable object, not even how they get the radiation turned back into matter." "The beam is focused, just like the light that passes through a camera lens. The photographic lens, using light rays, picks up a picture and reproduces it again on the plate, just the same as the express ray picks up an object and sets it down on the other side of the world. An analogy from television might help. You know that by means of the scanning disk, the picture is transformed into mere rapid fluctuations in the brightness of a beam of light. In a parallel manner, the focal plane of the express ray moves slowly through the object, progressively dissolving layers of the thickness of a single atom, which are accurately reproduced at the other focus of the instrument, which might be in Venus. But the analogy of the lens is the better of the two, for no receiving instrument is required, as in television. The object is built up of an infinite series of plane layers at the focus of the ray, no matter where that might be. Such a thing would be impossible with radio apparatus, because even with the best beam transmission, all but a tiny fraction of the power is lost, and power is required to rebuild the atoms. Do you understand, dear? Not altogether. But I should worry. Here comes breakfast. Let me butter your toast. A bell had rung at the shaft. She ran to it and returned with a great silver tray, laden with dainty dishes, which she set on a little side table. They sat down opposite each other and ate, getting as much satisfaction from contemplation of each other's faces as from the excellent food. When they had finished, she carried the tray to the shaft, slid it in a slot, and touched a button, thus disposing of the culinary cares of the morning. She ran back to Eric, who was once more staring distastefully at his typewriter. "Oh, darling, I'm thrilled to death about the Cosmic Express. If we could go to Venus, to a new life on a new world, and get away from all this hateful conventional society." "We can go to their office. It's only 5 minutes. The chap that operates the machine for the company is a pal of mine. He's not supposed to take passengers except between the offices they have scattered around the world, but I know his weak point." Eric laughed, fumbled with a hidden spring under his desk. A small polished object, gleaming silvery, slid down into his hand. Old friendship plus this would make him like spinach. 5 minutes later, Mr. Eric Stokes Harding and his pretty wife were in street clothes, light silk tunics of loose flowing lines, little clothing being required in the artificially warmed city. They entered an elevator and dropped 30 stories to the ground floor of the great building. There they entered a cylindrical car with rows of seats down the sides. Not greatly different from an ancient subway car, except that it was airtight, and was hurled by magnetic attraction and repulsion through a tube exhausted of air, at a speed that would have made an old subway rider gasp with amazement. In 5 more minutes their car had whipped up to the base of another building in the business section, where there was no room for parks between the mighty structures that held the unbroken glass roofs 200 stories above the concrete pavement. An elevator brought them up 150 stories. Eric led Nada down a long carpeted corridor to a wide glass door which bore the words, "Cosmic Express," stenciled in gold capitals across it. As they approached, a lean man carrying a black bag darted out of an elevator shaft opposite the door, ran across the corridor and entered. They pushed in after him. They were in a little room cut in two by a high brass grill. In front of it was a long bench along the wall that reminded one of the waiting room in an old railroad depot. In the grill was a little window with a lazy, brown-eyed youth leaning on the shelf behind it. Beyond him was a great glittering piece of mechanism, half hidden by the brass. A little door gave access to the machine from the space before the grill. The thin man in black, whom Eric now recognized as a prominent French heart specialist, was dancing before the window, waving his bag frantically, raving at the sleepy boy. "Quick! I have to tell you the truth. I have the most urgent necessity to go quickly. A patient I have in Paris that is in the most critical condition." "Hold your horses. Just a minute, mister. We got a client in the machine now. Russian diplomat from Moscow to Rio de Janeiro. $270.80, please. Your turn next. Remember, this is just an experimental service. Regular installations all over the world in a year. Ready now. Come on in." The youth took the money, pressed a button. The door sprang open in the grill, and the frantic physician leaped through it. "Lie down on the crystal, face up," the young man ordered. "Hands at your sides. Don't breathe. Ready?" He manipulated his dials and switches and pressed another button. "Why, hello, Eric, old man," he cried. "That's the lady you were telling me about. Congratulations." A bell jangled before him on the panel. "Just a minute, I've got a call." He punched the board again. Little bulbs lit and glowed for a second. The youth turned toward the half-hidden machine, spoke courteously. "All right, madam, walk out. Hope you found the transit pleasant." "But my Violet, my precious Violet!" A shrill female voice came from the machine. "Sir, what have you done with my darling Violet?" "I'm sure I don't know, madam. You lost it off your hat?" "None of your impertinence, sir. I want my dog." "Ah, the dog. Must have jumped off the crystal. You can have him sent on for 300 and—" "Young man, if any harm comes to my Violet, I'll appeal to the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals." "Very good, madam. We appreciate your patronage." The door flew open again. A very fat woman, puffing angrily, face highly colored, clothing shimmering with artificial gems, waddled pompously out of the door through which the frantic French doctor had so recently vanished. She rolled heavily across the room and out into the corridor. Shrill words floated back. "I'm going to see my lawyer, my precious Violet." The sallow youth winked. "And now, what can I do for you, Eric?" "We want to go to Venus, if that ray of yours can put us there." "To Venus? Impossible. My orders are to use the express merely between the 16 designated stations at New York, San Francisco, Tokyo, London, Paris. See here, Charlie." With a cautious glance toward the door, Eric held up the silver flask. "For old time's sake, and for this." The boy seemed dazed at sight of the bright flask. Then, with a single swift motion, he snatched it out of Eric's hand and bent to conceal it below his instrument panel. "Sure, old boy, I'll send you to heaven for that, if you'd give me the micrometer readings to set the ray with. But I tell you, this is dangerous. I've got a sort of television attachment for focusing the ray. I can turn that on Venus. I've been amusing myself watching the life there already. Terrible place. Savage. I can pick a place on high land to set you down, but I can't be responsible for what happens afterward. Simple, primitive life is what we're looking for. And now, what do I owe you?" "Oh, that's all right. Between friends, provided that stuff's genuine. Walk in and lie down on the crystal block. Hands at your sides. Don't move." The little door had swung open again, and Eric led Nada through. They stepped into a little cell, completely surrounded with mirrors and vast prisms and lenses and electron tubes. In the center was a slab of transparent crystal, 8 feet square and 2 inches thick, with an intricate mass of machinery below it. Eric helped Nada to a place on the crystal, lay down at her side. "I think the express ray is focused just at the surface of the crystal from below," he said. "It dissolves our substance to be transmitted by the beam. It would look as if we were melting into the crystal." "Ready," called the youth. "I think I've got it for you. Sort of a high island in the jungle. Nothing bad in sight now. But, I say, how are you coming back? I haven't got time to watch you." "Go ahead. We aren't coming back." "Gee, what is it, elopement? I thought you were married already, or is it business difficulties? The bears did make an awful raid last night. But you better let me set you down in Hong Kong." A bell jangled. "So long," the youth called. Nada and Eric felt themselves enveloped in fire. Sheets of white flame seemed to lap up about them from the crystal block. Suddenly there was a sharp tingling sensation where they touched the polished surface. Then blackness, blankness. The next thing they knew, the fires were gone from about them. They were lying in something extremely soft and fluid, and warm rain was beating in their faces. Eric sat up, found himself in a mud puddle. Beside him was Nada, opening her eyes and struggling up, her bright garments stained with black mud. All about rose a thick jungle, dark and gloomy, and very wet. Palm-like, the gigantic trees were flinging clouds of feathery green foliage high against a somber sky of unbroken gloom. They stood up, triumphant. "At last," Nada cried, "we're free, free of that hateful old civilization. We're back to nature." "Yes, we're on our feet now, not parasites on the machines." "It's wonderful to have a fine, strong man like you to trust in, Eric. You're just like one of the heroes in your books." "You're the perfect companion, Nada. But now we must be practical. We must build a fire, find weapons, set up a shelter of some kind. I guess it will be night pretty soon, and Charlie said something about savage animals he had seen in the television. We'll find a nice dry cave and have a fire in front of the door, and skins of animals to sleep on, and pottery vessels to cook in, and you will find seeds and grow grain. But first we must find a flint bed. We need flints for tools, and to strike sparks to make a fire with. We will probably come across a chunk of virgin copper, too. It's found native." Presently they set off through the jungle. The mud seemed to be very abundant and of a most sticky consistency. They sank into it ankle-deep at every step, and vast masses of it clung to their feet. A mile they struggled on, without finding where a provident nature had left them a single fragment of quartz, to say nothing of a mass of pure copper. "A darn shame," Eric grumbled, "to come 40 million miles and meet such a reception as this." Nada stopped. "Eric," she said, "I'm tired, and I don't believe there's any rock here anyway. You'll have to use wooden tools, sharpened in the fire." "Perhaps you're right. This soil seems to be of alluvian origin. Wouldn't be surprised if the native rock is some hundreds of feet underground. Your idea is better." "You can make a fire by rubbing sticks together, can't you?" "It can be done, I'm sure. I've never tried it myself. We need some dry sticks first." They resumed the weary march, with a good fraction of the new planet adhering to their feet. Rain was still falling from the dark heavens in a steady, warm downpour. Dry wood seemed scarce as the proverbial hen's teeth. "You didn't bring any matches, dear?" "Matches? Of course not. We're going back to nature." "I hope we get a fire pretty soon." "If dry wood were gold dust, we couldn't buy a hot dog." "Eric, that reminds me that I'm hungry." He confessed to a few pangs of his own. They turned their attention to looking for banana trees and coconut palms, but they did not seem to abound in the Venerian jungle. Even small animals that might have been slain with a broken branch had contrary ideas about the matter. At last, from sheer weariness, they stopped, and gathered branches to make a sloping shelter by a vast fallen tree trunk. "This will keep us out of the rain, maybe," Eric said hopefully, "and tomorrow, when it has quit raining, I'm sure we'll do better." They crept in as gloomy night fell without. They lay in each other's arms, the body warmth oddly comforting. Nada cried a little. "Buck up," Eric advised her. "We're back to nature, where we've always wanted to be." With the darkness, the temperature fell somewhat, and a high wind rose, whipping cold rain into the little shelter, and threatening to demolish it. Swarms of mosquito-like insects, seemingly not inconvenienced in the least by the inclement elements, swarmed about them in clouds. Then came a sound from the dismal, stormy night, a hoarse, bellowing roar, raucous, terrifying. Nada clung to Eric. "What is it, dear?" she chattered. "Must be a reptile, dinosaur, or something of that sort. This world seems to be about in the same state as the Earth when they flourished there, but maybe it won't find us." The roar was repeated, nearer. The earth trembled beneath a mighty tread. "Eric," a thin voice trembled, "don't you think it might have been better? The old life was not so bad after all." "I was just thinking of our rooms, nice and warm and bright, with hot foods coming up the shaft whenever we pushed the button, and the gay crowds in the park, and my old typewriter." "Eric," she called softly. "Yes, dear." "Don't you wish we had known better?" "I do." If he winced at the "we," the girl did not notice. The roaring outside was closer, and suddenly it was answered by another raucous bellow at considerable distance that echoed strangely through the forest. The fearful sounds were repeated alternately, and always the more distant seemed nearer, until the two sounds were together. And then an infernal din broke out in the darkness. Bellows, screams, deafening shrieks, mighty splashes, as if struggling titans had upset oceans, thunderous crashes, as if they were demolishing forests. Eric and Nada clung to each other, in doubt whether to stay or to fly through the storm. Gradually the sound of the conflict came nearer until the earth shook beneath them, and they were afraid to move. Suddenly the great fallen tree against which they had erected the flimsy shelter was rolled back, evidently by a chance blow from the invisible monsters. The pitiful roof collapsed on the bedraggled humans. Nada burst into tears. "Oh, if only, if only!" Suddenly flame lapped up about them, the same white flame they had seen as they lay on the crystal block. Dizziness, insensibility overcame them. A few minutes later they were lying on the transparent table in the Cosmic Express office, with all those great mirrors and prisms and lenses about them. A bustling, red-faced official appeared through the door in the grill, fairly bubbling apologies. "So sorry, an accident, inconceivable. I can't see how we got it. We got you back as soon as we could find a focus. I sincerely hope you haven't been injured." "Why, what? "Why, I happened in, found our operator drunk. I've no idea where he got the stuff. He muttered something about Venus. I consulted the auto-register and found 2 more passengers registered here that had been reported at our other stations. I looked up the duplicate beam coordinates and found that it had been set on Venus. I got men on the television at once, and we happened to find you. I can't imagine how it happened. I had the fellow locked up and the drylars are on the job. I hope you won't hold us for excessive damages." "No, I ask nothing except that you don't press charges against the boy. I don't want him to suffer for it in any way. My wife and I will be perfectly satisfied to get back to our apartment." "I don't wonder. You look as though you've been through, I don't know what. But I'll have you there in 5 minutes. My private car." Mr. Eric Stokes Harding, noted author of Primitive Life and Love, ate a hearty meal with his pretty spouse after they had washed off the grime of another planet. He spent the next 12 hours in bed. At the end of the month he delivered his promised story to his publishers, a thrilling tale of a man marooned on Venus with a beautiful girl. The hero made stone tools, erected a dwelling for himself and his mate, hunted food for her, defended her from the mammoth saurian monsters of the Venerian jungles. The book was a huge success. End of The Cosmic Express by Jack Williamson.
How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content.
The Pygmy Planet by Jack Williamson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. This story was first published in Astounding Stories, February 1932. Nothing ever happens to me, Larry Manahan grumbled under his breath, sitting behind his desk at the advertising agency which employed his services in return for the consideration of $50 a week. All the adventure I know is what I see in the movies or read about in magazines. What wouldn't I give for a slice of real life? Unconsciously, he tensed the muscles of his 6 feet of lean, hard body. His crisp, flame-colored hair seemed to bristle. His blue eyes blazed. He clenched a brown hammer of a fist. Larry felt himself an energetic, red-blooded square peg, badly afflicted with the urge for adventure, miserably wedged in a round hole. It is one of the misfortunes of our civilization that a young man who, for example, might have been an excellent pirate a couple of centuries ago, must be kept chained to a desk, and that seemed to be Larry's fate. Things happen to other people, he muttered. Why couldn't an adventure come to me? He sat staring wistfully at a picture of a majestic mountain landscape, soon to be used in the advertising of a railway company whose publicity was handled by his agency, when the jangle of the telephone roused him with a start. "Oh, Larry!" came a breathless, quivering voice. Then, with a click, the connection was broken. The voice had been feminine and had carried a familiar ring. Larry tried to place it as he listened at the receiver and attempted to get the broken connection restored. "Your party hung up and won't answer," the operator informed him. He replaced the receiver on the hook, still seeking to follow the thin thread of memory given him by the familiar note in that eager, excited voice. If only the girl had spoken a few more words. Then it came to him. "Agnes Sterling!" he exclaimed aloud. Agnes Sterling was a slender, elfish, dark-haired girl. Lovely, he had thought her, on the occasions of their few brief meetings. Larry knew her as the secretary and laboratory assistant of Dr. Travis Whiting, a retired college professor known for his work on the structure of the atom. Larry had called at the home laboratory of the savant months before to check certain statistics to be used for advertising purposes, and had met the girl there. Only a few times since had he seen her. Now she had called him in a voice that fairly trembled with excitement, and, he thought, dread, and she had been interrupted before she had time to give him any message. For a few seconds Larry stared at the telephone. Then he rose abruptly to his feet, crammed his hat on his head, and started for the door. "The way to find an adventure is to go after it," he muttered, "and this is the invitation." It was not many minutes later that he sprang out of a taxi at the front of the building in which Dr. Travis Whiting made his home and maintained a private experimental laboratory. It was a 2-story stucco house, rather out of date, set well back from the sidewalk, with a scrap of lawn and a few straggling shrubs before it. The door was closed, the windows curtained blankly. The place seemed deserted and forbidding. Larry ran up the uneven brick walk to the door and rang the bell. Impatiently he waited for a few moments. No sound came from within. He felt something ominous, fateful about the silent mystery that seemed to shroud the old house. For the first time it occurred to him that Agnes might be in physical danger as a result of some incautious experiment on the part of Dr. Whiting. Instinctively his hands sought the doorknob. To his surprise, the door was unlocked. It swung open before him. For a moment he stared, hesitating, into the dark hall revealed beyond. Then, driven by the thought that Agnes might be in danger, he advanced impulsively. The several doors opening into the hall were closed. The one at the back, he knew, gave admittance to the laboratory. Impelled by some vague premonition, he hastened toward it down the long hall and threw it open. As he stepped into the room, his foot slipped on a spot of something red. Recovering his balance with difficulty, he peered about. Bending down, Larry briefly examined the red spot on which he had slipped. It was a pool of fresh blood which had not yet darkened. Lying beside it, crimson splashed, was a revolver. As he picked up the weapon, he cried out in astonishment. Something had happened to the gun. The trigger guard was torn from it, and the cylinder crushed as if in some resistless grasp. The stock was twisted, and the barrel bent almost into a circle. The revolver had been crumpled by some terrific force, as a soft clay model of it might have been broken by the pressure of a man's hand. "Crimson shades of Caesar," he muttered, and dropped the crushed weapon to the floor again. His eyes swept the silent laboratory. It was a huge room, taking up all the rear part of the house, from the first floor to the roof. Gray daylight streamed through a skylight 20 feet overhead. The ends of the vast room were cluttered with electrical and chemical apparatus, but Larry's eye was caught at once by a strange and complex device which loomed across from him in the center of the floor. 2 pillars of intense light, a ray of crimson flame and another of deeply violet radiance, beat straight down from a complicated array of enormous, oddly shaped electron tubes, of mirrors and lenses and prisms, of coils and whirling disks, which reached almost to the roof. Upright, a yard in diameter and almost a yard apart, the strange columns of light were sharp-edged as 2 transparent cylinders filled with liquid light of ruby and of amethyst. Each ray poured down upon a circular platform of glass or polished crystal. Hanging between those motionless cylinders of red and violet light was a strange-looking greenish globe. A round ball, nearly a yard in diameter, hung between the rays, almost touching them. Its surface was oddly splotched with darker and lighter areas. It was spinning steadily at a low rate of speed. Larry did not see what held it up. It seemed hanging free several feet above the crystal platforms. Reluctantly, he withdrew his eyes from the mysterious sphere and looked about the room once more. No, the laboratory was vacant of human occupants. No one was hidden among the benches that were cluttered with beakers and test tubes and stills, or among the dynamos and transformers in the other end of the room. A confusion of questions beat through Larry's brain. What danger could be haunting this quiet laboratory? Was this the blood of Agnes Sterling, or the scientist who employed her that was now clotting on the floor? What terrific force had crumpled up the revolver? What had become of Agnes and Dr. Whiting, and of whatever had attacked them? Had Agnes called him after the attack, or before? Despite himself, his attention was drawn back to the little globe spinning so regularly, floating in the air between the pillars of red and violet flame. Floating alone, like a little world in space, without visible support, it might be held up by magnetic attraction, he thought. A tiny planet! His mind quickened at the idea, and he half forgot the weird mystery gathering about him. He stepped nearer the sphere. It was curiously like a miniature world. The irregular bluish areas would be seas, the green and brown spaces land. In some parts the surface appeared mistily obscured, perhaps by masses of cloud. Larry saw an odd-looking lamp, set perhaps 10 feet behind the slowly spinning, floating ball, throwing upon it a bright ray of vividly blue light. Half the strange sphere was brilliantly illuminated by it, the rest was in comparative darkness. That blue lamp, it came to Larry, lit the sphere as the sun lights the earth. "Nonsense," he muttered. "It's impossible." Aroused by the seeming wonder of it, he was drawn nearer the ball. It spun rather slowly, Larry noted, and each rotation consumed several seconds. He could distinguish green patches that might be forests, and thin silvery lines that looked like rivers, and broad red-brown areas that must be deserts, and the broad blue stretches that suggested oceans. "A toy world!" he cried. "A laboratory planet! What an experiment!" Then his eyes, looking up, caught the glistening, polished lenses of a powerful magnifying glass, which hung by a black ribbon from a hook on one of the heavy steel beams which supported the huge mass of silently whirring apparatus. Eagerly he unfastened the magnifier. Holding it before his eyes, he bent toward the strange sphere spinning steadily in the air. "Suffering shades of Caesar!" he ejaculated. Beneath the lens, a world was racing. He could see masses of vividly green forest, vast expanses of bare, cracked, ochreous desert, wastes of smooth blue ocean. Then he was gazing at a city? Larry could not be sure that he had seen correctly. It had slipped very swiftly beneath his lens. But he had a momentary impression of tiny, fantastic buildings clustered in an elf-like city. A Pygmy Planet spinning in the laboratory like a world in the gulf of space. What could it mean? Could it be connected with the strange call from Agnes? With the blood on the floor? With the strange and ominous silence that shrouded the deserted room? "Oh, Larry!" A clear, familiar voice rang suddenly from the door. "You came!" Startled, Larry leaped back from the tiny whirling globe and turned to the door. A girl had come silently into the room. It was Agnes Sterling. Her dark hair was tangled, her small face was flushed, and her brown eyes were wide with fear. In a white hand, which shook a little, she carried a small, gold-plated automatic pistol. She ran nervously across the wide floor to Larry, with relief dawning in her eyes. "I'm so glad you came," she gasped, panting with excitement. "I started to call you on the phone, but then I was afraid it would kill you if you came. Please be careful. It may come back any minute. You'd better go away. It just took Dr. Whiting." "Wait a minute," Larry put in. "Just one thing at a time. Let's get this straight. To begin with, what is it that might kill me, and that got the doctor?" "It's terrible," she gasped, trembling. "A monster! You must go away before it comes back." Larry drew a tall stool from beside one of the crowded tables and placed it beside her. "Don't get excited," he urged. "I'm sure everything will be all right. Just sit down and tell me about it. The whole story. Just what is going on here, and what happened to Dr. Whiting." He helped her upon the stool. She looked up at him gratefully and began to speak in a rapid voice. "You see that little planet? The monster came from that and carried the doctor back there, and I know it will soon be back for another victim, for sacrifice." She had pointed across the room toward the strange little globe which hung between the pillars of red and violet light. "Please go slow," Larry broke in. "You're too fast for me. Are you trying to tell me that that spinning ball is really a planet?" Agnes seemed a little more composed, though she was still flushed and breathing rapidly. Her small hand still gripped the bright automatic. "Yes, it is a planet. The Pygmy Planet, Dr. Whiting called it. He said it was the great experiment of the century. You see, he was testing evolution. We began with the planet, young and hot, and watched it till it is now almost as old as Mars. We watched the change and development of life upon it, and the rise and decay of a strange civilization, until now its people are strange things, with human brains and mechanical bodies, worshipping a rusty machine like a god." "Go slow," Larry pleaded again. "I don't see. Did the doctor create that planet himself?" "Yes. It began with his work on atomic structure. He discovered that certain frequencies of the X-ray, so powerful that they are almost akin to the cosmic ray, have the power of altering electronic orbits. Every atom, you know, is a sort of solar system, with electrons revolving about a proton. And these rays would cause the electrons to fall into incredibly smaller orbits, causing vast reduction in the size of the atoms, and in the size of any object which the atoms formed. They would cause anything, living or dead, to shrink to inconceivably microscopic dimensions, or restore it to its former size, depending upon the exact wavelength used. And time passes far more swiftly for the tiny objects, probably because the electrons move faster in their smaller orbits. That is what suggested to Dr. Whiting that he would be able to watch the entire life of a planet in the laboratory. And so at first we experimented merely with solitary specimens or colonies of animals. But on the Pygmy Planet, we have watched the life of a world, the whole panorama of evolution. "It seems too wonderful," Larry muttered. "Could Dr. Whiting actually decrease his size and become a dwarf?" "No trick at all," Agnes assured him. "All you'll have to do is stand in the violet beam to shrink, and move over to the red one when you want to grow. I have been several times with Dr. Whiting to the Pygmy Planet." "Been?" Larry stopped, breathless with astonishment. "See the little airplane?" Agnes said, pointing under the table. Larry gasped. Beneath the table stood a toy airplane. The spread of its glistening, perfect wings was hardly 3 feet. A wonderful, delicate toy, accurate in every detail of propeller, motor, and landing gear, of brace and rudder and aileron. Then he realized that it was no toy at all, but a faithful miniature of a commercial plane, a complete tiny copy of one of the latest single-motor cabin monoplane models. "It looks like it would fly," he said. "A friend of mine has a big one just like it. Taught me to fly in it last summer vacation. This is the very image of it." "It will fly," Agnes assured him, now composed enough to smile at his amazement. "I have been with the doctor to the Pygmy Planet in it." "You stand in the violet ray until you're about 3 inches high," she explained, "and then get into the plane. Then you fly up and into the violet ray at the point where it touches the planet, and remain there while you grow smaller. When you are the right size, all you have to do is drop to the surface and land. To come away, you rise into the red ray and stay in it till you are grown to proper size, when you come down and land." You've actually done that?" he gasped. "It sounds like a fairy story." "Yes, I've done it," she assured him. Then she shuddered apprehensively. "Oh, and the machine monsters, Dr. Whiting called them, have learned to do it too. One of them came down the red ray and attacked him. The doctor had a gun, but what could he do against one of those?" She shivered. "It carried him back up the violet beam just a few minutes ago. I started to phone you. Then I was afraid you would be hurt." "Me? Hurt?" Larry burst out. "What about you, here alone?" "It was my business. Dr. Whiting told me there might be danger when he hired me." "And now, what can we do?" Larry demanded. "I don't know," she said slowly. "I'm afraid one of the monsters will be back after a new victim. We could smash the apparatus, but it is too wonderful to be destroyed. And besides, Dr. Whiting may have escaped. He may be alive there in the deserts." "We might fly up in the little plane," Larry proposed doubtfully. "I think I could pilot it. If you want—" The girl's body stiffened. Her brown eyes widened with sudden dread, and her small face went pale. She slipped quickly from the stool, drawing in her breath with a sort of gasp. The hand that gripped the automatic trembled a little. "What's the matter?" Larry cried. "I thought," she gasped, "I think I see something in the ray. The machine monster is coming back." Her lips tightened. She lifted the little automatic and began to shoot into the pillar of crimson fire beside the tiny spinning globe. Larry watched tensely, saw a curious bird-like something fluttering about in the red ray, swiftly growing larger. Deliberately, and pausing to aim carefully for each shot, the girl emptied the little gun at the figure. Her body was rigid, her small face was firmly set, though she was breathing very fast. A curious numbness had come over Larry. His only physical sensations were the quick hammering of his heart and a parching dryness in his throat. Terror stiffened him. Though he would not have admitted it, he was paralyzed with fear. The glittering thing that fluttered about in the crimson ray was not an easy target. When the gun was empty, it seemed still unharmed, and its wings had increased to a span of a foot. "Too late!" Agnes gasped. "Why didn't we do something?" Trembling, horror-stricken, she shrank toward Larry. He was staring at the thing in the pillar of scarlet light. It had dropped to the crystal disk upon which the red ray fell from the huge glowing tube above. It stood there, motionless except for the swift increase of its size. Larry gazed at it, lost in fear and wonder. It was like nothing he had ever seen. What was it that Agnes had said of machine monsters, of human brains in mechanical bodies? His brain reeled. He strained his eyes to distinguish the monstrosity more clearly. It was veiled in crimson flame, he could not see it distinctly. But suddenly, when it was as tall as himself, it sprang out into the room, toward Larry and the shuddering girl. Just off the crystal disk, beyond the scarlet pillar of fire, it paused for long seconds, seeming to regard them with malevolent eyes. For the first time Larry could see it plainly. Its body, or its central part, was a tube of transparent crystal, an upright cylinder rounded at upper and lower ends. It was nearly a foot in diameter and 4 feet long. It seemed filled with a luminous purple liquid. About the cylinder were 3 bands of greenish, glistening metal. Attached to the lower band were 4 jointed legs of the same bright green metal upon which the strange thing stood. Set in the middle band were 2 glittering, polished lenses, which seemed to serve as eyes, and Larry felt that they were gazing at him with malevolent menace. Behind the eyes, 2 wings sprang from the green band. Ingenious, folding wings of thin plates and bars of green metal. And from the upper band sprung 4 slender, glistening, whip-like tentacles, metallic and brilliantly green, 2 yards in length. They writhed with strange life. It seemed a long time to Larry that the thing stood motionless, seeming to stare evilly at them with eye-like lenses. Then, lurching forward a little, it moved toward them upon legs of green metal. And now Larry saw another amazing thing about it. Floating in the brilliant violet liquid that filled the crystal tube was a gray mass, wrinkled and corrugated. This was divided by deep clefts into right and left hemispheres, which, in turn, were separated into larger upper and smaller lower segments. White filaments ran through the violet liquid from its base toward the 3 rings or bands of green metal that encircled the cylinder. In an instant, Larry realized that the gray mass was a human brain. The larger upper part, the cerebrum, the smaller mass at the back, the cerebellum, and the white filaments were nerves by means of which this brain controlled its astounding mechanical body. A brain in a machine. The violet liquid, it came to Larry in his trance of wonder, must take the place of blood, feeding the brain cells, absorbing waste. An eternal mind within a machine, free from the ills and weaknesses of the body, and devoid too of any pity, of any tender feelings. A cold and selfish mind, without emotion, unless it might worship itself or its mechanical body. It was this monster that had spilt the pool of blood drying on the floor near the door. And it was these glistening green snake-like tentacles that had crumpled the revolver into a broken mass of steel. Abruptly the machine monster darted forward, running swiftly upon its forelegs of green metal. Slender tentacles reached out toward the shuddering girl at Larry's shoulder. "Run!" Agnes gasped to him quickly. "It will kill you!" The girl tried to push him back. As she touched him, Larry recovered from his daze of wondering fear. Agnes was in frightful danger, and facing it with quiet courage. He must find a weapon. Wildly he looked about him. His eyes fell upon the tall, heavy wooden stool upon which Agnes had been sitting. "Get back!" he shouted to her. He snatched up the stool and, swinging it over his head, sprang toward the machine of violet-filled crystal and glittering green metal. "Stop!" Agnes screamed in a terrified voice. "You can't!" She had run before him. He seized her arm and swung her back behind him. Then he advanced warily toward the machine monster, which had paused and seemed to be regarding him with sinister intentness through its glistening crystal eye lenses. With all his strength, Larry struck at the crystal cylinder, swinging the stool like an axe. A slender, metallic green tentacle whipped out, tore the stool from his hands, and sent it crashing across the room to splinter into fragments on the opposite wall. Larry, sent off his balance, staggered toward the glittering machine. As he stumbled against the transparent tube that contained its brain, he clenched his fist to strike futilely at it. A snake-like metal tentacle wrapped itself about him. He was hurled to the floor to sprawl grotesquely among broken apparatus. His head came against the leg of a bench. For a few moments he was dazed, but it seemed only a few seconds to him before he had staggered to his feet, rubbing his bruised head. Anxiously he peered about the room. The machine monster and Agnes were gone. He stumbled back to the mass of apparatus in the center of the huge laboratory. Intently he gazed into the upright pillar of crimson flame. Nothing was visible there. "No, the other," he gasped. "The violet is the way they went." He turned to the companion ray of violent radiance that beat straight down on the opposite side of the tiny, whirling planet. And in that motionless torrent of chill violet flame, he saw them, tiny already and swiftly dwindling. With green wings outspread, the machine monster was beating swiftly upward through the pillar of purple-blue flame. And, close against the crystal tube that contained its brain, was Agnes, held fast by the whip-like tentacles of glistening green metal. Larry moved to spring after them, into the torrent of violet light, but sudden caution restrained him. "I'd shrink too," he muttered. "And then where would I be? I'd be standing on the glass platform, I guess, and the thing flying off over my head." He gazed at the rapidly dwindling forms of Agnes Sterling and her amazing abductor. As it grew smaller, the machine monster flew higher in the violet beam until it was opposite the tiny spinning planet. The distance between the red and violet rays was just slightly more than the diameter of the Pygmy world. The sphere hung between them, one side of it a fraction of an inch from the red, the other as near the violet. Opposite the elfin planet, the monster ceased to climb. It hung there in the violet ray an inch from the surface of the little world. And still it swiftly dwindled. It was no larger than a fly, and Larry could barely distinguish the form of the girl helpless in the green tentacles. Soon she and the monster became a mere greenish speck. Suddenly they were gone. For a little time he stood watching the point where they had vanished, watching the red and violet rays that poured straight down upon the crystal discs, watching the tiny green-blue planet spinning so steadily between the bright rays. Abruptly he recovered from his fascination of wonder. "What did she say?" he muttered. "Something about the monsters carrying off people to sacrifice to a rusty machine that they worshipped as a god? It took her for that?" He clenched his fists. His lips became a straight line of determination. "Then I guess we try a voyage in the little plane. A slim chance, maybe, but decidedly better than none." He returned to the table, dropped on his knees, inspected the tiny airplane. A perfect miniature, delicately beautiful, its slim, small wings were bright as silver foil. Carefully he opened the door and peered into the diminutive cabin. 2 minute rifles, several Lilliputian pistols, and boxes of ammunition to match lay on the rear seat of the plane. "So we are prepared for war," he remarked, grinning in satisfaction. "And the next trick, I suppose, is to get shrunk to fit the plane. About 3 inches, she said. Lord, it's a queer thing to think about." He got to his feet, walked back to the machine in the center of the room with its twin pillars of red and violet flame, and the tiny world floating between them. He started to step into the violet ray, then hesitated, shivering involuntarily, like a swimmer about to dive into icy cold water. Turning back to one of the benches, he picked up a wooden funnel rack and tossed it to the crystal disk beneath the violet ray. Slowly it decreased in size until it had vanished from sight. "Safe, I suppose," he muttered, "but how do I know when I'm small enough?" After a moment he picked up a glass bottle which measured about 3 inches in height, set it on the floor beside the crystal disk. "I dive out when I get to be the size of the bottle," he murmured. With that, he leaped into the violet beam. He felt no unusual sensation except one of pleasant, tingling warmth, as if the direct rays of the sun were beaming down upon him. For a moment he feared that his size was not being affected. Then he noticed, not that he appeared to be becoming smaller, but that the laboratory seemed to be growing immensely larger. The walls seemed to race away from him. The green-blue sphere of the tiny planet where he proposed to visit expanded and drew away above his head. Abruptly fearful, alarmed at the hugeness of the room, he turned to look at the bottle he had placed to serve as a standard of size. It had grown with everything else until it seemed to be about 3 feet high, and it was swiftly expanding. It reached to the level of his shoulder and higher. He ran to the edge of the crystal disk, which now seemed a floor many yards across, and leaped from its edge. It was a dozen steps to where he had left the bottle, and it was as tall as himself. He started across the floor of the laboratory toward the table under which the toy plane stood. The incredible immensity of his surroundings awed him strangely. The walls of the room seemed distant. Cyclopean cliffs, the roof was like a sky. Table legs towered up like enormous columns. It seemed 100 yards across the strangely rough floor to the plane. As he drew near it, it gave him huge satisfaction to see that it was of normal size, correctly proportioned to his own dimensions. "Good luck," he muttered, "that I can fly." He paused as he reached the cabin's open door to wonder at the astounding fact that, a little while ago, he had opened that door with a hand larger than his entire body now was. "I guess this is my day of wonders," he muttered. "Allah knows I had to wait long enough for it." First he examined the weapons in the cabin. There were 2 heavy sporting rifles and 2 .45 automatics. There were also 2 smaller automatics which he supposed had been intended for Agnes's use, and there was abundant ammunition. Then he inspected the plane. It looked to be in excellent condition in every way. The gasoline and oil tanks were full. He set about starting the motor, using the plane's inertia starter, which was driven by an electric motor. Soon the engine coughed, sputtered, and gave rise to a roaring rhythmic note that Larry found musical. When the motor was warm, he opened the throttle and taxied out from beneath the colossal table and across the laboratory floor toward the titanic mechanism in the center of the room. The disk of crystal was set almost flush with the floor, its edge beveled. The plane rolled easily upon it and out into the cyclopean pillar of violet flame. Once more, Larry felt the sensation that everything about him except the plane itself was expanding inconceivably in size. Soon the laboratory's walls and roof were lost in hazy blue distance. He could distinguish only the broad, bright field formed by the surface of the crystal disk, with the floor stretching away beyond it like a vast plain, and above, the green-blue sphere of the tiny planet, bright on one side and dark on the other, so that it looked like a half-moon, immensely far off. As he waited, he noticed a curious little dial in a lower corner of the instrument board, which he had not seen at first. One end of its graduated scale was marked Earth Normal, the other Pygmy Planet Normal. A tiny black needle was creeping slowly across the scale toward Pygmy Planet Normal. "That's how we tell what size we are without having to look at a bottle," he muttered. When the area of the crystal platform appeared to be about half a square mile, he decided that he would now have sufficient space to spiral up the violet ray toward the planet. If he waited too long to start, the distance would become impossibly great. He gave the little plane the gun. The motor thundered a throbbing song, the ship rolled smoothly forward over the polished surface, gained flying speed, and took the air without a shock. "Feels good to hold the stick again," Larry murmured. Making small circles to keep within the upright pillar of violet radiance, he climbed steadily and as rapidly as possible, keeping his eyes upon the brilliant half-moon of the Pygmy Planet. The strangest flight in the annals of aviation. He was flying toward a goal that, a few minutes before, he could have touched. Toward the goal that, at the beginning of his flight, was only a few lengths of his plane away. And his size dwindled so rapidly as he flew that the planet seemed to swell and draw away from him. As Larry and the plane grew smaller, the relative size of the violet ray increased, so there was no longer much danger of flying out of it. It seemed that he flew through a world of violet flame. He met a curious problem in time. It is evident that time passes faster for a small animal than for a large one, because nerve currents require a shorter time in transit, and all thought and action is consequently speeded up. It took a 100-foot dinosaur nearly a second to know that his tail had been pinched. A fly can get underway in time to escape a descending swatter. The Pygmy Planet rotated in a few seconds of Earth time. One of its inhabitants might have lived, aged, and died in the duration of a single day in our larger world. So Larry found that time seemed to pass more rapidly, or rather that the time of the world he had left appeared to move more slowly, as he adventured into smallness. He had been flying, it seemed to him, nearly an hour, when he reached the level of the planet's equator. Now it seemed a vast world, filling half the visible universe. He flew toward it steadily until he knew, by the fading before him of the violet flame which now seemed to fill all space, that he was near the edge of the ray. And as he flew, he watched the little scale upon which the black needle was now nearing the line marked Pygmy Planet Normal. Circling slowly, keeping always on the level of the planet's equator and near the edge of the violet ray, so as to be as close as possible to his landing place when he reached the proper size, he watched the creeping black needle. Too, he scanned with eager eyes the planet floating before him. Bare, red deserts, narrow strips of green vegetation, shrunken blue oceans, silvery lines of rivers, passed in fascinating panorama beneath his eyes. The rate of the planet's spinning seemed continually to lessen with the changing of his own sense of time. "Agnes!" Larry thought of her with a curious, eager pain in his heart. She was somewhere on that strange ancient world, a prisoner of weird machine monsters, intended victim of a grotesque sacrificial ceremony. Could he find her in the vastness of an unfamiliar world, and having found her, would there be a chance to rescue her from her hideous captors? The project seemed insane, but Larry felt a queer, unfamiliar urge which he knew would drive him on until he had discovered and saved her, or until he was dead. At last, when it seemed to Larry nearly 3 hours since he had begun this amazing flight, the crawling ebon needle reached the mark, Pygmy Planet normal. He flew out of the wall of violet flame toward the planet's surface. Before, the distance between the planet and the ray's edge had seemed only the fraction of an inch. Now it appeared to be many miles. Abruptly, the Pygmy Planet, which had seemed to be beside him, appeared to swing about so that it was beneath him. He knew that it was change merely in his sensations. He was feeling the gravitation of the new world. It was pulling him toward it. He cut the throttle and settled the plane into a long glide, a glide that was to end upon the surface of a new planet. In what seemed half an hour more, Larry had made a safe landing upon the Pygmy Planet. He had come down upon a stretch of fairly smooth, red, sandy desert, which seemed to stretch illimitably toward the rising sun, which direction Larry instinctively termed east. To the west was a line of dull green, evidently the vegetation along a stream. The ochre desert was scattered with sparse lumps of reddish, spiky scrub. Larry taxied the plane into one of those thickets. Finding canvas and rope in the cabin, he staked down the machine and muffled the motor. Then, selecting a rifle and a heavy automatic from the weapons in the cabin, and filling his pockets with extra ammunition, he left the plane and set out with brisk steps toward the green line of vegetation. "I'll follow along the river," he reasoned. "It may lead me somewhere, and it will show the way back to the plane. I may come across something in the way of a clue. Can't go exploring by air, or I'll burn up all the gas and be stranded here." To his surprise, the watercourse proved to be an ancient canal, walled with crumbling masonry. Its channel was choked with mud and thorny, thick-leaved desert shrubs of unfamiliar variety, but a feeble current still flowed along it. After some reflection, Larry set out along the banks of the canal. He followed it for 2 days. Curious straight bars of light were visible across the sky, a band of violet in the morning, one of crimson at evening. Their apparent motion was in the same direction as that of the sun. The bars of light puzzled him considerably before it occurred to him that they must be the red and violet rays. "So you wait till evening and then fly up into the red ray to go home," he muttered. "But I may not need that information," he added grimly. "Seems to be a pretty big job to search a planet on foot for one person, and I'm not going back without Agnes." In the afternoon of the second day he came within view of a city. He could discern vast, imposing walls and towers of dark stone. It stood in the barren red desert, far back from the green line of the old canal. Larry left the canal and started wearily across toward it. He had covered several miles of the distance before he saw that the lofty towers were falling, the magnificent walls crumbling. The city was ruined, dead, deserted. The realization brought him a great flood of despair. He had hoped to find people, friends, from whom he might get food and information about this unfamiliar planet. But the city was dead. Larry was standing there in the midst of the vast red plain between ruined city and ruined canal, tired, hungry, lonely, and hopeless. He was looking up at the white sun, trying to comfort himself with the thought that the brilliant luminary was merely a queer blue lamp, that he was upon a tiny experimental world in a laboratory. But the thought brought him no relief, only confusion and a sense of incredulity. Then he saw the machine monster, a glittering winged thing of crystalline green metal, identical with the one he had encountered in the laboratory. It must already have seen him, for it was dropping swiftly toward him. Larry started to run, took a few staggering steps. Then he recalled the heavy rifle slung over his shoulder. Moving with desperate haste, he got it into his hands and raised it just as the monster dropped to the red sand a dozen yards away from him. Steadily he covered the crystal cylinder within which the thing's brain floated in luminous violet liquid. His finger tightened on the trigger, ready to send a heavy bullet crashing into it. Then he paused, swore softly, lowered the gun. "If I kill it," he murmured, "I may never find Agnes. And if I let it carry me off, it may take me where she is." He walked toward the monster, across the red sand. It stood uncertainly upon green metal legs, seeming to stare at him strangely with eye-like lenses. Its wings of thin green metal plates were folded. Its 4 green tentacles were twitching oddly. Abruptly, it sprang upon him. A green tentacle seized the rifle and snatched it from his hands. He felt the automatic pistol and the ammunition being removed from his pockets. Then, firmly held in the flexible arms of green metal, he was lifted against the cylinder of violet liquid. The monster spread its broad emerald wings, and Larry was swiftly borne into the air. In a few minutes the wide ruins of the ancient city were spread below him, with the green line of the choked canal cutting the infinite red waste of the desert beyond it. The monster flew westward. For a considerable time nothing save barren, ochreous desert was in view. Then Larry's weird captor flew near a strange city, a city of green metal. The buildings were most fantastic. Pyramids of green, crowned with enormous glistening spires of emerald metal, an impassable wall surrounding the city. Larry had expected the monster to drop into the city, but it carried him on and finally settled to the ground several miles beyond. The green tentacles released him as the thing landed, and he sprawled beside it, dizzy after his strange flight. As Larry staggered uncertainly to his feet, he saw that the monster had released him in an open pen. It was a square area, nearly 50 yards on each side, and fenced with thin posts or rods of green metal, perhaps 20 feet high. Set very close together, and sharply pointed at the top, they formed a barrier apparently insurmountable. In the center of the pen was a huge and strange machine built of green metal. It looked very worn and ancient. It was covered with patches of bluish rust or corrosion. At first it looked quite strange to Larry. Then he was struck by a vaguely familiar quality about it. Looking closer, he realized that it was a colossal steam hammer. Its design, of course, was unfamiliar, but in the vast corroded frame he quickly picked out a steam chest, cylinder, and the great hammer weighing many tons. He gasped when his eyes went to the anvil. A man was chained across it. A man in torn, grimy clothes, fastened with fetters of green metal upon wrists and ankles, so that his body was stretched beneath the massive hammer. He seemed to be unconscious. Upon his head, which was turned toward Larry, was a red and swollen bruise. The monster which had dropped Larry within the pen rose again into the air, and Larry started forward, trying to remember just what Agnes had told him of a machine to which the monster sacrificed. This must be the machine, this ancient steam hammer. As he moved forward, Agnes came into view. She walked around the massive base of the great machine, carrying a bowl filled with a fragrant brown liquid. She stopped at the sight of Larry and uttered a little cry. The bowl fell from her hands, and the fragrant liquid splashed out on the ground. Her brown eyes went wide with delighted surprise. Then a look of pain came into them. "Larry, Larry!" she cried. "Why did you come?" "To get you," he answered, trying to speak as lightly as he could. "And the best way I knew to find you was to let one of the monsters bring me. Cheer up." But even to himself his voice had a tone of discouragement. She smiled wanly. "I don't see anything to be cheerful about." Her small face was set and a little white. "Dr. Whiting is going to be smashed under the hammer of this dreadful machine whenever the steam is up. Then it's my turn, and yours. That's nothing to laugh about." "But we aren't smashed yet," Larry insisted. "By the way, what was in that bowl?" he went on, glancing down. "I forgot to bring lunch." He grinned. She looked down, startled. "Oh, Dr. Whiting's soup. Poor fellow, I'm afraid he'll never awake to eat it. There's plenty more. Come around here." She picked up the bowl and led him around the base of the machine. Then she filled the bowl again with the fragrant red-brown liquid from a tall urn of green metal. Larry took the dish eagerly and gulped down the rather insipid and tasteless food. "And the monsters worship this old steam hammer?" he inquired, when his hunger was appeased. "Yes. I think the thing is worked by steam generated by volcanic heat. Anyhow, there isn't any boiler, and the steam pipe comes up out of the ground. You can see that. So it runs on without any attention, though I guess the heat is dying down, since it is several days between blows of the hammer. And I guess the monsters have forgotten how they used to rule machines. They seem to have depended upon machines, even giving up their own bodies for mechanical ones, until the machine ruled them. And when this old hammer kept pounding on through the ages using volcanic steam, I guess they got to considering it alive. They began to regard it as a sort of god, and when they got the idea of giving it sacrifices, it was natural enough to place the victims under the hammer. They went back to Dr. Whiting, who was chained across the anvil. He was still breathing, but unconscious. He had been injured in a struggle with the monsters, and his body was much emaciated. Agnes explained that he had been a prisoner in the pen for many months of the time of this world, waiting his turn to die. She said that the monsters had just completed the extermination of another race upon the Pygmy Planet, and were just turning to the greater world for victims. Larry noticed that the great hammer was slowly rising in its guides as the pressure of the steam from the planet's interior increased. In a few hours, just at sunset, it reached the top of its stroke. The air above the pen was suddenly filled with glittering swarms of the green-winged monsters, sweeping slowly about in measured flight, with strange order in their masses. They had come to witness the sacrifice. With an explosive rush of steam, the hammer came down. The ground trembled beneath the terrific blow. The roaring of escaping steam and the crash of the impact were almost deafening. A heavy white cloud shrouded the corroded green machine. When the hammer slowly lifted, only a red smear was left. Agnes had shrunk, trembling against Larry's shoulder. He had put his arms about her and was holding her almost fiercely. "My turn next," she whispered. "And don't try to fight them. It will only make them hurt you." "I can't let them take you, Agnes," Larry cried in an agonized voice, and the words seemed to leap out of themselves. "Because I love you." "You do?" Agnes cried in a thin, choking voice, pressing herself against him. "Ever since the first time you came to the laboratory." A score of the monster forms of violet-filled crystal and gleaming green metal had dropped into the pen. They tore Agnes from Larry's arms, hurling him roughly to the ground at the bottom of the green metal fence. For some time he was unconscious. When he had staggered painfully to his feet, it was night. The monsters were gone. The starless sky was black and empty. Calling out weakly and stumbling about the pen, he found Agnes. She was chained where Dr. Whiting had been. She was conscious, unharmed. For a time they talked a little, exchanging broken, incoherent phrases. Then they went to sleep, lying on the anvil beneath that mighty hammer that was slowly lifting to strike another fearful blow. When the sun had risen again, Larry brought Agnes some of the brown soup from the metal urn, which had been filled again. Then, when he had satisfied himself, he started clambering up the massive frame of the hammer. If he could put it out of commission! It was a difficult task. He slipped back many times, and finally had to choose another place to make the ascent. Twice he slipped and almost fell from a considerable height. But finally he reached the massive wheel of the valve, which seemed to control the admission of steam into the cylinder above the hammer. If he could but close that, the steam would be confined in the chest below, and when the pressure reached a certain point, something should happen. The valve was not easy to turn. It seemed fixed with the corrosion of ages. For hours Larry wrestled with it. Then he left it, realizing that he must find something to use for a hammer. A vigorous search of the pen's hard earth floor failed to reveal any stone that would do. He turned his attention to the machine, and presently saw a slender projecting lever high up on the side of the vast frame, which looked as if it had been weakened by corrosion. After a perilous climb, he reached the bar of green metal and swung his weight upon it. It broke, and he plunged to the ground with the bar in his hand. Clambering up once more to the great valve, he hammered it until the rust that stiffened it was loosened. Then he struggled with the valve until it was closed. "We'll see what happens," he muttered. Returning to the ground, he set to work to break the green metal fetters upon Agnes's wrists and ankles, using the broken lever as hammer and file. For the greater part of 6 days he toiled at that task, while the great hammer rose slowly. But the green metal seemed very hard. One arm was free at the end of the 2nd day, the other on the 4th. He had one ankle loose on the morning of the 6th day. But as evening came on, and the great hammer reached the top of its stroke, the 4th chain still defied him. Before sunset, a swarm of the monsters appeared, wheeling on green wings. He was forced to leave his work, hiding his improvised file. Agnes still lay across the anvil to conceal from the monsters the fact that the chains were broken. Larry sat close beside her, nursing hands that were blistered and sore from his days of filing at the chains. A sudden clatter came from the huge mechanism above them, and a sharp hiss of steam which became louder. "It works," Larry whispered to Agnes. "The old valve held, and the steam can't get into the cylinder to smash us. But Allah knows what will happen when the pressure rises in that old steam chest." Darkness came. Dusk swallowed the wheeling machine monsters. All night Larry and Agnes waited silently together on the great anvil, listening to the hissing steam from above, which was slowly becoming a shrill, monotonous scream, monotonous, always higher, shriller. The sun rose again. Still the green-winged monsters wheeled about. They came in glittering swarms, thousands of them. They came nearer the machine now and flew about more swiftly, as if excited. Then it happened. There was a roar like thunder, and a colossal bellowing explosion. The air was filled suddenly with scalding steam and with screaming fragments of the bursting steam chest. In the midst of it all, Larry felt a crushing blow upon his head, and a blanket of darkness fell upon him. "The monsters are all gone, darling," Agnes's voice reached him, "as though they were very much frightened. And a piece of the old hammer hit the fence and knocked a hole in it. You must go. Leave me." "Oh, leave you?" Larry groaned, struggling to sit up. "Not a bit of it." He touched his head gingerly, felt a swollen bruise. Collecting a few fragments of the wrecked machine to serve as tools, he fell to work again upon Agnes's remaining chain. Already he had cut a deep groove in it. 2 hours later, it was broken. Carrying the metal urn of brownish liquid, they crept out through the hole in the fence which had been torn by the flying fragment of a broken casing of green metal. They left the wreck of the machine which a strange race had worshipped as a bloody god, and hurried furtively into the desert of red sand. Making a wide circuit about the fantastic city of green metal, which Larry had seen from the air, they struck out eastward across the desolate ochreous waste. The food in the urn, eaten sparingly, lasted until the end of the 8th day. On the morning of the 9th they came in view of the green line of the ancient canal. It was hours later that they staggered weakly over its wall of crumbling masonry, clambered down into the muddy, weed-grown channel, and drank thirstily of green, tepid water. Larry found his old trail beyond the canal. They followed it back. In the middle of the afternoon they stumbled up to the thicket of spiky desert growth in which Larry had hidden the plane. The machine was undamaged. Before sunset Larry had removed the stake ropes, slipped the canvas cover from the motor, turned the plane around, inspected it, and examined the strip of smooth, hard red sand upon which he had landed. Agnes pointed out the dim band of crimson across the sky from north to south, slowly rising toward the zenith. "That's the red ray," she said. "We fly into it." "And a happy moment when we do," Larry rejoined. He roused the motor to life. As the bar of crimson light neared the zenith, the plane rolled forward across the sand and took off. Climbing steeply, Larry anxiously watched the approach of the red band. The gravitation of the Pygmy Planet seemed to diminish as he gained altitude, until presently he could fly vertically from it without circling it at all. He set the bow toward the scarlet bar across the sky before him. And suddenly he was flying through ruby flame. His eyes went to the little scale at the corner of the instrument board. He saw the little ebon needle waver, leave the mark designated Pygmy Planet Normal, and start toward Earth Normal. For what seemed a long time, he was wheeling down the crimson ray. A few times he looked back at Agnes in the rear seat. She had gone to sleep. Then a vast circular field was below, the crystal platform. Larry landed the plane upon it, taxied to the center, and stopped there with the motor idling. The laboratory, taking shape in the blue abyss about him, seemed to contract swiftly. Presently the plane covered most of the crystal disk. He taxied quickly off, stopped on the floor nearby, and cut the ignition. Agnes woke. Together they clambered from the plane's cabin and walked back into the crimson ray. Once more the vast spaces of the room seemed to shrink until it looked familiar once more. The Pygmy Planet and the huge machine looming over them dwindled to natural size. Agnes, watching a scale on the frame of the mechanism which Larry had not noticed, leaped suddenly from the red ray, drawing him with her. "We don't want to be giants," she laughed. Larry drew a deep breath and looked about him. Once more he was in his own world, and surveying it in his normal size. He became aware of Agnes standing close against him. He suddenly took her in his arms and kissed her. "Wait a minute," she objected, slipping quickly from his arms. "What are we going to do about the Pygmy Planet? Those monsters might come again, even if you did wreck their god. And Dr. Whiting, poor fellow, but we mustn't let those monsters come back." Larry doubled up a brown fist and drove it with all his strength against the little globe that spun so steadily between the twin upright cylinders of crimson and of violet flame. His hand went deep into it, and it swung from its position, hung unsteadily for a moment, and then crashed to the laboratory floor. It was crushed like a ball of soft brown mud. It splattered. "Now I guess they won't come back," Agnes said. "A pity to spoil all Dr. Whiting's work, though." Larry was standing motionless, holding up his fist and looking at it oddly. "I smashed a planet. Think of it. I smashed a planet. Just the why, it was just this evening at the office. I was wishing for something to happen." End of The Pygmy Planet. Salvage in Space by Jack Williamson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. This story was first published in Astounding Stories, March 1933. Recorded by Phil Chenevert, July 2019, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. His planet was the smallest in the solar system, and the loneliest. Thad Allen was thinking as he straightened wearily in the huge, bulging, inflated fabric of his Osprey space armor. Walking awkwardly in the magnetic boots that held him to the black mass of meteoric iron, he mounted a projection and stood motionless, staring moodily away through the visual panels of his bulky helmet into the dark mystery of the void. His welding arc dangled at his belt, the electrode still glowing red. He had just finished securing to this slowly accumulating mass of iron his most recent find, a meteorite the size of his head. 5 perilous weeks he had labored to collect this rugged lump of metal, a jagged mass some 10 feet in diameter, composed of hundreds of fragments that he had captured and welded together. His luck had not been good. His findings had been heartbreakingly small. The spectroflash analysis had revealed that the content of the precious metals was disappointingly minute. Author's note: the meteor or asteroid belt between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter is mined by such adventurers as Thad Allen for the platinum, iridium, and osmium that all meteoric irons contain in small quantities. The meteor swarms are supposed by some astronomers to be fragments of a disrupted planet which, according to Bode's law, should occupy this space. End of author's note. On the other side of this tiny sphere of hard-won treasure, his Millen atomic rocket was sputtering, spurts of hot blue flame jetting from its exhaust. A simple mechanism bolted to the first sizable fragment he had captured. It drove the iron ball through space like a ship. Through the magnetic soles of his insulated boots, Thad could feel the vibration of the iron mass beneath the rocket's regular thrust. The magazine of uranite fuel capsules was nearly empty now, he reflected. He would soon have to turn back toward Mars. Turn back. But how could he, with so slender a reward for his efforts? Meteor mining is expensive. There was his bill at Millen and Helion, Mars, for uranite and supplies, and the unpaid last installment on his Osprey suit. How could he outfit himself again if he returned with no more metal than this? There were men who averaged 1,000 tons of iron a month. Why couldn't fortune smile on him? He knew men who had made fabulous strikes, who had captured whole planetoids of rich metal, and he knew weary, white-haired men who had braved the perils of vacuum and absolute cold and bullet-swift meteors for hard years, who still hoped. But sometime fortune had to smile, and then the picture came to him. A tower of white metal along the low red hills near Helion. A slim, graceful tower of argent, rising in a fragrant garden of flowering Martian shrubs, purple and saffron, and a girl waiting at the front door. A trim, slender girl in white, with blue eyes and hair richly brown. Thad had seen the White Tower many times on his holiday tramps through the hills about Helion. He had even dared to ask if it could be bought, to find that its price was an amount that he might not amass in many years at his perilous profession. But the girl in white was yet only a glorious dream. The strangeness of interplanetary space and the somber mystery of it pressed upon him like an illimitable and deserted ocean. The sun was a tiny white disk on his right, hanging between rosy coronal wings. His native Earth, a bright greenish point suspended in the dark gulf below it. Mars, nearer, smaller, a little ochre speck above the shrunken sun. Above him, below him, in all directions, was vastness, blackness, emptiness. Ebon infinity sprinkled with far, cold stars. Thad was alone. Utterly alone. No man was visible in all the supernatural vastness of space, and no work of man save the few tools of his daring trade and the glittering little rocket bolted to the black iron behind him. It was terrible to think that the nearest human being must be tens of millions of miles away. On his first trips, the loneliness had been terrible, unendurable. Now he was becoming accustomed to it. At least he no longer feared that he was going mad. But sometimes— Thad shook himself and spoke aloud, his voice ringing hollow in his huge metal helmet. "Brace up, old top. In good company when you're by yourself, as Dad used to say. Be back in Helion in a week or so, anyhow. Look up Dan and Chuck and the rest of the crowd again at Comet's place. What price a friendly boxing match with Mason, or an evening at the Teleview Theater? Fresh air instead of this stale synthetic stuff. Real food in place of these tasteless concentrates. A hot bath instead of greasing yourself. Too dull out here. Life—" He broke off, set his jaw. No use thinking about such things. Only made it worse. Besides, how did he know that a whirring meteor wasn't going to flash him out before he got back? He drew his right arm out of the bulging sleeve of the suit into its ample interior, found a cigarette in an inside pocket and lighted it. The smoke swirled about in the helmet, drawn swiftly into the air filters. "Darn clever, these suits," he murmured. "Food, smokes, water generator, all where you can reach them. And darn expensive, too. I'd better be looking for pay metal." He clambered to a better position, stood peering out into space, searching for the tiny gleam of sunlight on a meteoric fragment that might be worth capturing for its content of precious metals. For an hour he scanned the black, star-strewn gulf, as the sputtering rocket continued to drive him forward. "There she glows!" he cried suddenly, and grinned. Before him was a tiny, glowing fleck that moved among the unchanging stars. He stared at it intently, breathing faster in the helmet. Always he thrilled to see such a moving gleam. What treasure it promised! At first sight it was impossible to determine size or distance or rate of motion. It might be 10,000 tons of rich metal, a fortune. It would more probably prove to be a tiny stony mass, not worth capturing. It might even be large and valuable, but moving so rapidly that he could not overtake it with the power of the diminutive Millen rocket. He studied the tiny speck intently, with practiced eye as the minutes passed. An untrained eye would never have seen it at all among the flaming hosts of stars. Skillfully he judged from its apparent rate of motion and its slow increase in brilliance, its size and distance from him. Must be fair size, he spoke aloud at last. 100 tons, I'll bet my helmet. But scooting along pretty fast. Stretch the little old rocket to run it down. He clambered back to the rocket, changed the angle of the flaming exhaust to drive him directly across the path of the object ahead, filled the magazine again with the little pellets of uranite, which were fed automatically into the combustion chamber, and increased the firing rate. The trailing blue flame reached farther backward from the incandescent orifice of the exhaust. The vibration of the metal sphere increased. Thad left the sputtering rocket and went back where he could see the object before him. It was nearer now, rushing obliquely across his path. Would he be in time to capture it as it passed, or would it hurtle by ahead of him and vanish in the limitless darkness of space before his feeble rocket could check the momentum of his ball of metal? He peered at it as it drew closer. Its surface seemed oddly bright, silvery, not the dull black of meteoric iron. And it was larger, more distant than he had thought at first. In form, too, it seemed curiously regular, ellipsoid. It was no jagged mass of metal. His hopes sank, rose again immediately. Even if it were not the mass of rich metal for which he had prayed, it might be something as valuable and more interesting. He returned to the rocket, adjusted the angle of the nozzle again, and advanced the firing time slightly, even at the risk of a ruinous explosion. When he returned to where he could see the hurtling object before him, he saw that it was a ship, a tapering, silver-green rocket flyer. Once more, his dreams were dashed. The officers of interplanetary liners lose no love upon the meteor miners, claiming that their collected masses of metal, almost helpless, always underpowered, are menaces to navigation. Thad could expect nothing from the ship save a heliographed warning to keep clear. But how came a rocket flyer here, in the perilous swarms of the meteor belt? Many a vessel had been destroyed by collision with an asteroid in the days before charted lanes were cleared of drifting metal. The lanes more frequently used between Earth, Mars, Venus, and Mercury were of course far inside the orbits of the asteroids, and the few ships running to Jupiter's moons avoided them by crossing millions of miles above their plane. Could it be that legendary green ship, said once to have mysteriously appeared, sliced up and drawn within her hull several of the primitive ships of that day, and then disappeared forever after in the remote wastes of space? Absurd, of course. He dismissed the idle fancy and examined the ship still more closely. Then he saw that it was turning end over end very slowly. That meant that its gyros were stopped, that it was helpless, drifting, disabled, powerless to avoid hurtling meteoric stones. Had it blundered unawares into the belt of swarms, been struck before the danger was realized? Was it a derelict with all dead upon it? Either the ship's machinery was completely wrecked, Thad knew, or there was no one on watch. For the controls of a modern rocket flyer are so simple and so nearly automatic that a single man at the bridge can keep a vessel upon her course. It might be, he thought, that a meteorite had ripped open the hull, allowing the air to escape so quickly that the entire crew had been asphyxiated before any repairs could be made. But that seemed unlikely, since the ship must have been divided into several compartments by airtight bulkheads. Could the vessel have been deserted for some reason? The crew might have mutinied and left her in the life tubes. She might have been robbed by pirates and set adrift. But with the space lanes policed as they were, piracy and successful mutiny were rare. Thad saw that the flyer's navigation lights were out. He found the heliograph signal mirror at his side, sighted it upon the ship, and worked the mirror rapidly. He waited, repeated the call. There was no response. The vessel was plainly a derelict. Could he board her and take her to Mars? By law, it was his duty to attempt to aid any helpless ship, or at least to try to save any endangered lives upon her. And the salvage award, if the ship should be deserted and he could bring her safe to port, would be half her value. No mean prize, that. Half the value of ship and cargo, more than he was apt to earn in years of mining the meteor belt. With new anxiety, he measured the relative motion of the gleaming ship. It was going to pass ahead of him, and very soon. No more time for speculation. It was still uncertain whether it would come near enough so that he could get a line to it. Rapidly, he unslung from his belt the apparatus he used to capture meteors. A powerful electromagnet with a thin, strong wire fastened to it, to be hurled from a helix gun. He set the drum on which the wire was wound upon the metal at his feet, fastened it with its magnetic anchor, wondering if it would stand the terrific strain when the wire tightened. Raising the helix to his shoulder, he trained it upon a point well ahead of the rushing flyer, and stood waiting for the exact moment to press the lever. The slender spindle of the ship was only a mile away now, right in the sunlight. He could see no break in her polished hull save for the dark rows of circular ports. She was not by any means completely wrecked. He read the black letters of her name. Red Dragon. The name of her home port below was in smaller letters, but in a moment he made them out. San Francisco. The ship then came from the Earth, from the very city where Thad was born. The gleaming hull was near now, only a few hundred yards away. Passing. Aiming well ahead of her to allow for her motion, Thad pressed the key that hurled the magnet from the helix. It flung away from him, the wire screaming from the reel behind it. Thad's mass of metal swung on past the ship as he returned to the rocket and stopped its clattering explosions. He watched the tiny black speck of the magnet. It vanished from sight in the darkness of space, appeared again against the white burnished hull of the rocket ship. For a painful instant he thought he had missed. Then he saw that the magnet was fast to the side of the flyer, near the stern. The line tightened. Soon the strain would come upon it as it checked the momentum of the mass of iron. He set the friction brake. Thad flung himself flat, grasped the wire above the reel. Even if the mass of iron tore itself free, he could hold to the wire and himself reach the ship. He flung past the deserted vessel. Behind it, his lump of iron swung like a pebble in a sling. A cloud of smoke burst from the burned lining of the friction brake in the reel. Then the wire was all out. There was a sudden jerk, and the hard-gathered sphere of metal was gone, snapped off into space. Thad clung desperately to the wire, muscles cracking, tortured arms almost drawn from their sockets. Fear flashed over his mind. What if the wire broke and left him floating helpless in space? It held, though, to his relief. He was trailing behind the ship. Eagerly he seized the handle of the reel, began to wind up the mile of thin wire. Half an hour later, Thad's suited figure bumped gently against the shining hull of the rocket. He got to his feet and gazed backward into the starry gulf, where his sphere of iron had long since vanished. Somebody is going to find himself a nice chunk of metal, all welded together and equipped for rocket navigation, he murmured. As for me, well, I've simply got to run this tub to Mars." He walked over the smooth, refulgent hull, held to it by magnetic soles. Nowhere was it broken, though he found scars where small meteoric particles had scratched the brilliant polish. So no meteor had wrecked the ship. What, then, was the matter? Soon he would know. The Red Dragon was not large, 130 feet long, Thad estimated, with a beam of 25 feet. But her trim lines bespoke design recent and good. The double ring of black projecting rockets at the stern told of unusual speed. A pretty piece of salvage, he reflected, if he could land her on Mars. Half the value of such a ship, unharmed and safe in port, would be a larger sum than he dared put in figures. And he must take her in, now that he had lost his own rocket. He found the life tubes, 6 of them, slender, silvery cylinders lying secure in their niches, 3 along each side of the flyer. None was missing. So the crew had not willingly deserted the ship. He approached the main airlock at the center of the hull, behind the projecting dome of the bridge. It was closed. A glance at the dials told him there was full air pressure within it. It had then last been used to enter the rocket, not to leave it. Thad opened the exhaust valve, let the air hiss from the chamber of the lock. The huge door swung open in response to his hand upon the wheel, and he entered the cylindrical chamber. In a moment the door was closed behind him. Air was hissing into the lock again. He started to open the faceplate of his helmet, longing for a breath of air that did not smell of sweat and stale tobacco smoke, as that in his suit always did, despite the best chemical purifiers. Then he hesitated. Perhaps some deadly gas from the combustion chambers. Thad opened the inner valve and came upon the upper deck of the vessel. A floor ran the full length of the ship, broken with hatches and companionways that gave to the rocket rooms, cargo holds, and quarters for crew and passengers below. There was an enclosed ladder that led to bridge and navigating room in the dome above. The hull formed an arched roof over it. The deck was deserted, lit only by 3 dim blue globes hanging from the curved roof. All seemed in order. The firefighting equipment hanging on the walls, and the huge metal patches and welding equipment for repairing breaks in the hull. Everything was clean, bright with polish or new paint. And all was very still. The silence held a vague, brooding threat that frightened Thad, made him wish for a moment that he was back upon his rugged ball of metal. But he banished his fear and strode down the deck. Midway of it, he found a dark stain upon the clean metal. The black of long dried blood. A few tattered scraps of cloth beside it. No more than bloody rags. And a heavy meat cleaver half hidden beneath a bit of darkened fabric. Mute record of tragedy. Thad strove to read it. Had a man fought here and been killed? It must have been a struggle of peculiar violence, to judge by the dark spattered stains and the indescribable condition of the remnants of clothing. But what had he fought? Another man or some thing? And what had become of victor and vanquished? He walked on down the deck. The torturing silence was broken by the abrupt patter of quick little footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, nervously, with a hand going instinctively to his welding arc, which he knew would make a fairly effective weapon. It was merely a dog, a little dog, yellow, nondescript, pathetically delighted. With a sharp, eager bark, it leaped up at Thad, pawing at his armor and licking it, standing on its hind legs and reaching toward the visor of his helmet. It was very thin, as if from long starvation. Both ears were ragged and bloody, and there was a long, unhealed scratch across the shoulder, somewhat inflamed, but not a serious wound. The bright, eager eyes were alight with joy, but Thad thought he saw fear in them, and even through the stiff fabric of the osprey suit, he felt that the dog was trembling. Suddenly, with a low whine, it shrank close to his side, and another sound reached Thad's ears. A cry, weird and harrowing beyond telling, a scream so thin and so high that it roughened his skin, so keenly shrill that it tortured his nerves. A sound of that peculiar frequency that is more agonizing than any bodily pain. When silence came again, Thad was standing with his back against the wall, the welding arc in his hand. His face was cold with sweat, and a queer chill prickled up and down his spine. The yellow dog crouched whimpering against his legs. Ominous, threatening stillness filled the ship again, disturbed only by the whimpers and frightened growls of the dog. Trying to calm his overwrought nerves, Thad listened, strained his ears. He could hear nothing, and he had no idea from which direction the terrifying sound had come. A strange cry. Thad knew it had been born in no human throat, nor in the throat of any animal he knew. It had carried an alien note that overcame him with instinctive fear and horror. What had voiced it? Was the ship haunted by some dread entity? For many minutes Thad stood upon the deck, waiting, tensely grasping the welding tool, but the nerve-shattering scream did not come again, nor any other sound. The yellow dog seemed half to forget its fear. It leaped up at his face again with another short little bark. The air must be good, he thought, if the dog could live in it. He unscrewed the faceplate of his helmet and lifted it. The air that struck his face was cool and clean. He breathed deeply, gratefully, and at first he did not notice the strange odor upon it, a curious, unpleasant scent, earthly, almost fetid, unfamiliar. The dog kept leaping up, whining. "Hungry, boy?" Thad whispered. He fumbled in the bulky inside pockets of his suit, found a slab of concentrated food, and tossed it out through the opened panel. The dog sprang upon it, wolfed it eagerly, and came back to his side. Thad set at once about exploring the ship. First he ascended the ladder to the bridge. A metal dome covered it, studded with transparent ports. Charts and instruments were in order, and the room was vacant, heavy with the fatal silence of the ship. Thad had no expert's knowledge of the flyer's mechanism, but he had studied interplanetary navigation to qualify for his license to carry masses of metal under rocket power through the space lanes and into planetary atmospheres. He was sure he could manage the ship if its mechanism were in good order, though he was uncertain of his ability to make any considerable repairs. To his relief, a scrutiny of the dials revealed nothing wrong. He started the gyro motors, got the great wheels to spinning, and thus stopped the slow end-over-end tumbling of the flyer. Then he went to the rocket controls, warmed 3 of the tubes, and set them to firing. The vessel answered readily to her helm. In a few minutes, he had the red fleck of Mars over the bow. "Yes, I can run her all right," he announced to the dog, which had followed him up the steps, keeping close to his feet. "Don't worry, old boy. We'll be eating a juicy beefsteak together in a week. At Comet's place in Helion, down by the canal. Not much style, but the eats. And now we're going to do a little detective work and find out what made that disagreeable noise, and what happened to all your fellow astronauts. Better find out before it happens to us." He shut off the rockets and climbed down from the bridge again. When Thad started down the companionway to the officers' quarters in the central one of the 5 main compartments of the ship, the dog kept close to his legs, growling, trembling, hackles lifted. Sensing the animal's terror, pitying it for the naked fear in its eyes, Thad wondered what dramas of horror it might have seen. The cabins of the navigator, calculator, chief technician, and first officer were empty, and forbidding with the ominous silence of the ship. They were neatly in order, and the berths had been made since they were used. But there was a large bloodstain, black and circular, on the floor of the calculator's room. The captain's cabin held evidence of a violent struggle. The door had been broken in. Its fragments, with pieces of broken furniture, books, covers from the berth, and 3 service pistols, were scattered about in indescribable confusion, all stained with blood. Among the frightful debris, Thad found several scraps of clothing of dissimilar fabrics. The guns were empty. Attempting to reconstruct the action of the tragedy from those grim clues, he imagined that the 5 officers, aware of some peril, had gathered here, fought, and died. The dog refused to enter the room. It stood at the door looking anxiously after him, trembling and whimpering pitifully. Several times it sniffed the air and drew back, snarling. Thad thought that the unpleasant earthy odor he had noticed upon opening the faceplate of his helmet was stronger here. After a few minutes of searching through the wildly disordered room, he found the ship's log, or its remains. Many pages had been torn from the book, and the remainder, soaked with blood, formed a stiff black mass. Only one legible entry did he find, that on a page torn from the book, which somehow had escaped destruction. Dated 5 months before, it gave the position of the vessel and her bearings. She was then just outside Jupiter's orbit, earthward bound, and concluded with a remark of sinister implications. "Another man gone this morning, Sims, assistant technician. A fine workman. O'Dean swears he heard something moving on the deck. Cook thinks some of the doctor's stuffed monstrosities have come to life. Ridiculous, of course. But what is one to think?" Pondering the significance of those few lines, Thad climbed back to the deck. Was the ship haunted by some weird death that had seized the crew man by man mysteriously? That was the obvious implication. And if the flyer had been still outside Jupiter's orbit when those words were written, it must have been weeks before the end. A lurking, invisible death. The scream he had heard. He descended into the forecastle and came upon another such silent record of frightful carnage as he had found in the captain's cabin. Dried blood, scraps of cloth, knives, and other weapons. A fearful question was beginning to obsess him. What had become of the bodies of those who must have died in these conflicts? He dared not think the answer. Gripping the welding arc, Thad approached the after hatch giving to the cargo hold. Trepidation almost overpowered him, but he was determined to find the sinister menace of the ship before it found him. The dog whimpered, hung back, and finally deserted him, contributing nothing to his peace of mind. The hold proved to be dark. An indefinite black space, oppressive with the terrible silence of the flyer. The air within it bore still more strongly the unpleasant fetor. Thad hesitated on the steps. The hold was not inviting, but at the thought he must sleep unguarded while taking the flyer to Mars, his resolution returned. The uncertainty, the constant fear would be unendurable. He climbed on down, feeling for the light button. He found it as his feet touched the floor. Blue light flooded the hold. It was filled with monstrous things, colossal creatures, such as nothing that had ever lived upon the earth, like nothing known in the jungles of Venus or the deserts of Mars, or anything that had been found upon Jupiter's moons. They were monsters remotely resembling insects or crustaceans, but as large as horses or elephants. Creatures upreared upon strange limbs, armed with hideously fanged jaws, cruel talons, frightful saw-toothed snouts, and glittering scales, red and yellow and green. They leered at him with phosphorescent eyes, yellow and purple. They cast grotesquely gigantic shadows in the blue light. A cold shock of horror started along Thad's spine at the sight of those incredible nightmare things. Automatically he flung up the welding tool, flicking over the lever with his thumb so that violet electric flames played about the electrode. Then he saw that the crowding, hideous things were motionless, that they stood upon wooden pedestals, that many of them were supported upon metal bars. They were dead, mounted, collected specimens of some alien life. Grinning wanly and conscious of a weakness in the knees, he muttered, "They sure will fill the museum, if everybody gets a kick out of them that I did. A little too realistic, I'd say. Guess these are the stuffed monstrosities mentioned in the page out of the log. No wonder the cook was afraid of them. Some of them do look hellishly alive." He started across the hold, shrinking involuntarily from the armored enormities that seemed crouched to spring at him, motionless eyes staring. So, at the end of the long space, he found the treasure. Glittering in the blue light, it looked unreal, incredible, a dazzling dream. He stopped among the fearful things that seemed gathered as if to guard it, and stared with wide eyes through the opened faceplate of his helmet. He saw neat stacks of gold ingots, new, freshly smelted, bars of silver-white iridium, of argent platinum, of blue-white osmium, many of them thousands of pounds, Thad knew. He trembled at the thought of their value, almost beyond calculation. Then he saw the coffer, lying beyond the piled, gleaming ingots. A huge box, 8 feet long, made of some crystal that glittered with snowy whiteness, filled with sparkling, iridescent gleams, and inlaid with strange designs, apparently in vermilion enamel. With a little cry, he ran toward the chest, moving awkwardly in the loose, deflated fabric of the osprey suit. Beside the coffer, on the floor of the hold, were literally a mountain of flame. Blazing gems, heaped as if they had been carelessly dumped from it, cut diamonds, incredibly gigantic, monster emeralds, sapphires, rubies, and strange stones that Thad did not recognize. And Thad gasped with horror when he looked at the designs of the vermilion inlay in the white gleaming crystal. Weird forms, shapes of creatures somewhat like gigantic spiders, and more unlike them. Demoniac things, wickedly fanged, jaws slavering, executed with masterly skill that made them seem living, menacing, secretly gloating. Thad stared at them for long minutes, fascinated almost hypnotically. 3 times he approached the chest to lift the lid and find what it held, and 3 times the unutterable horror of those crimson images thrust him back, shuddering. "Nothing but pictures," he muttered hoarsely. A 4th time he advanced, trembling, and seized the lid of the coffer. Heavy, massive, it was fashioned also of glistening white crystal, and inlaid in crimson with weirdly hideous figures. Great hinges of white platinum held it on the farther side. It was fastened with a simple heavy hasp of the precious metal. Hands quivering, Thad snapped back the hasp, lifted the lid. New treasure in the chest would not have surprised him. He was prepared to meet dazzling wonders of gems or priceless metal, nor would he have been astonished at some weird creature, such as one of those whose likenesses were inlaid in the crystal. But what he saw made him drop the massive lid. A woman lay in the chest, motionless, in white. In a moment he raised the lid again, examined the still form more closely. The woman had been young. The features were regular, good to look upon. The eyes were closed, the white face apparently very peaceful. Save for the extreme cadaverous pallor, there was no mark of death. With a fancy that the body might be miraculously living, sleeping, Thad thrust an arm out through the opened panel of his suit and touched a slender, bare white arm. It was stiff, very cold. The still, pallid face was framed in fine brown hair. The fair, small hands were crossed upon the breast, over the simple white garment. A queer ache came into his heart. Something made him think of a white tower in the hills near Helion, and a girl waiting in its fragrant garden of saffron and purple. A girl like this. The body lay upon a bed of blazing jewels. It appeared, Thad thought, as if the pile of gems upon the floor had been hastily scraped from the coffer to make room for the quiet form. He wondered how long it had lain there. It looked as if it might have been living but minutes before. Some preservative. His thought was broken by a sound that rang from the open hatchway on the deck above, the furious barking and yelping of the dog. Abruptly, that was silent, and in its place came the uncanny and terrifying scream that Thad had heard once before on this flyer of mystery. A shriek so keen and shrill that it seemed to tear out his nerves by their roots. The voice of the haunter of the ship. When Thad came back upon the deck, the dog was still barking nervously. He saw the animal forward, almost at the bow, hackles raised, tail between its legs. It was slinking backward, barking sharply as if to call for aid. Apparently, it was retreating from something between Thad and itself. But Thad, searching the dimly lit deck, could see no source of alarm, nor could the structures upon it have shut any large object from his view. "It's all right," Thad called, intending to reassure the frightened animal, but finding his voice queerly dry. "Coming on the double, old man, don't worry." The dog had reached the end of the deck. It stopped yelping, but snarled and whined as if in terror. It began darting back and forth, moving exactly as if something were slowly closing in upon it, trapping it in the corner, but Thad could see nothing. Then it made a wild dash back toward Thad, darting along by the wall as if trying to run past an unseen enemy. Thad thought he heard quick, rasping footsteps then that were not those of the dog, and something seemed to catch the dog in midair as it leaped. It was hurled howling to the deck. For a moment it struggled furiously, as if an invisible claw had pinned it down. Then it escaped and fled whimpering to Thad's side. He saw a new wound across its hips, 3 long, parallel scratches from which fresh red blood was trickling. Regular scraping sounds came from the end of the deck where no moving thing was to be seen. Sounds such as might be made by the walking of feet with unsheathed claws. Something was coming back toward Thad. Something that was invisible. Terror seized him with the knowledge. He had nerved himself to face desperate men or a savage animal. But an invisible being that could creep upon him and strike unseen? It was incredible. Yet he had seen the dog knocked down and the bleeding wound it had received. His heart paused, then beat very quickly. For the moment he thought only blindly of escape. He knew only an overpowering desire to hide, to conceal himself from the invisible thing. Had it been possible, he might have tried to leave the flyer. Beside him was one of the companionways amidships, giving access to the compartment of the vessel that he had not explored. He turned, leaped down the steps with the terrified dog at his heels. Below, he found himself in a short hall, dimly lighted. Several metal doors opened from it. He tried one at random. It gave. He sprang through, let the dog follow, closed, and locked it. Trying to listen, he leaned weakly against the door. The rushing of his breath, swift and regular, the loud hammer of his thudding heart, the dog's low whines, then unmistakable scraping sounds outside. The scratching of claws, Thad knew. Invisible claws. He stood there, bracing the door with the weight of his body, holding the welding arc ready in his hand. Several times the hinges creaked, and he felt a heavy pressure against the panels, but at last the scratching sounds ceased. He relaxed. The monster had withdrawn, at least for a time. When he had time to think, the invisibility of the thing was not so incredible. The mounted creatures he had seen in the hold were evidence that the flyer had visited some unknown planet where weird life reigned. It was not beyond reason that such a planet should be inhabited by beings invisible to human sight. Human vision, he knew, utilizes only a tiny fraction of the spectrum. The creature must be largely transparent to visible light, as human flesh is radiolucent to hard X-rays. Quite possibly it could be seen by infrared or ultraviolet light. Evidently it was visible enough to the dog's eyes, with their different range of sensitivity. Pushing the subject from his mind, he turned to survey the room into which he had burst. It had apparently been occupied by a woman. A frail blue silk dress and more intimate items of feminine wearing apparel were hanging above the berth. 2 pairs of delicate black slippers stood neatly below it. Across from him was a dressing table with a large mirror above it. Combs, pens, jars of cosmetic cluttered it, and Thad saw upon it a little leather-bound book, locked, stamped on the back, Diary. He crossed the room and picked up the little book, which smelled faintly of jasmine. Momentary shame overcame him at thus stealing the secrets of an unknown girl. Necessity, however, left him no choice but to seize any chance of learning more of this ship of mystery and her invisible haunter. He broke the flimsy fastening. Linda Cross was the name written on the fly-leaf in a firm, clear, feminine hand. On the next page was the photograph, in color, of a girl, the brown-haired girl whose body Thad had discovered in the crystal coffer in the hold. Her eyes, he saw, had been blue. He thought she looked very lovely, like the waiting girl in his old dream of the silver tower in the red hills by Helion. The diary, it appeared, had not been kept very devotedly. Most of the pages were blank. One of the first entries, dated a year and a half before, told of a party that Linda had attended in San Francisco, and of her refusal to dance with a certain man referred to as Benny, because he had been unpleasantly insistent about wanting to marry her. It ended, "Dad said tonight that we're going off in the Dragon again. All the way to Uranus, if the new fuel works as he expects. What a lark, to explore a few new worlds of our own. Dad says one of Uranus's moons is as large as Mercury, and Benny won't be proposing again soon." Turning on, Thad found other scattered entries, some of them dealing with the preparations for the voyage, the start from San Francisco, and a huge bunch of flowers from Benny. The long months of the trip through space, out past the orbit of Mars, above the meteor belt, across Jupiter's orbit, beyond the track of Saturn, which was the farthest point that rocket explorers had previously reached, and on to Uranus, where they could not land because of the unstable surface. The remainder of the entries Thad found less frequent, shorter, bearing the mark of excitement. Landing upon Titania, the third and largest satellite of Uranus, unearthly forests sheltering strange and monstrous life, the hunting of weird creatures and mounting them for museum specimens. Then the discovery of a ruined city, whose remains indicated that it had been built by a lost race of intelligent, spider-like things. The finding of a temple whose walls were of precious metals, containing a crystal chest filled with wondrous gems. The smelting of the metal into convenient ingots, and the transfer of the treasure to the hold. The first sinister note there entered the diary. Some of the men say we shouldn't have disturbed the temple. Think it will bring us bad luck. Rubbish, of course. But one man did vanish while they were smelting the gold. Poor Mr. Tom James. I suppose he ventured away from the rest, and something caught him. The few entries that followed were shorter, and showed increasing nervous tension. They recorded the departure from Titania, made almost as soon as the treasure was loaded. The last was made several weeks later. 12 men had vanished from the crew, leaving only gouts of blood to hint the manner of their going. The last entry ran, "Dad says I'm to stay in here today. Old dear, he's afraid the thing will get me, whatever it is. It's really serious. 2 men taken from their berths last night, and not a trace. Some of them think it's a curse on the treasure. One of them swears he saw Dad's stuffed specimens moving about in the hold. Some terrible thing must have slipped aboard the flyer out of the jungle, that's what Dad and the captain think. Queer they can't find it. They've searched all over. Well," musing and regretful, Thad turned back for another look at the smiling girl in the photograph. What a tragedy her death had been. Reading the diary had made him like her. Her balance and humor, her quiet affection for Dad, the calm courage with which she seemed to have faced the creeping, lurking death that darkened the ship with its unescapable shadow. How had her body come to be in the coffer, he wondered, when all the others were gone? It had shown no marks of violence. She must have died of fear. No, her face had seemed too calm and peaceful for that. Had she chosen easy death by some poison, rather than that other dreadful fate? Had her body been put in the chest to protect it, and the poison arrested decomposition? Thad was still studying the picture, thoughtfully and sadly, when the dog, which had been silent, suddenly growled again and retreated from the door toward the corner of the room. The invisible monster had returned. Thad heard its claws scratching across the door again, and he heard another dreadful sound. Not the long, shrill scream that had so grated on his nerves before, but a short, sharp coughing or barking, a series of shrill, indescribable notes that could have been made by no beast he knew. The decision to open the door cost a huge effort of Thad's will. For hours he had waited, thinking desperately, and the thing outside the door had waited as patiently, scratching upon it from time to time, uttering those dreadful, shrill, coughing cries. Sooner or later he would have to face the monster. Even if he could escape from the room and avoid it for a time, he would have to meet it in the end, and it might creep upon him while he slept. To be sure, the issue of the combat was extremely doubtful. The monster, apparently, had succeeded in killing every man upon the flyer, even though some of them had been armed. It must be large and very ferocious. But Thad was not without hope. He still wore his osprey suit, the heavy fabric made of metal wires impregnated with a tough elastic composition should afford considerable protection against the thing. The welding arc, intended to fuse refractive meteoric iron, would be no mean weapon at close quarters. And the quarters would be close. If only he could find some way to make the thing visible. Paint, or something of the kind, would stick to its skin. His eyes, searching the room, caught the jar of face powder on the dressing table. Dash that over it. It ought to stick enough to make the outline visible. So at last, holding the powder ready in one hand, he waited until a time when the pressure upon the door had just relaxed, and he knew the monster was waiting outside. Swiftly, he opened the door. Thad had partially overcome the instinctive horror that the unseen being had first aroused in him, but it returned in a sickening wave when he heard the short, shrill coughing cries, hideously eager, that greeted the opening of the door, and the quick rasping of naked claws upon the floor. Sounds from nothingness. He flung the powder at the sound. A form of weird horror materialized before him, still half invisible, half outlined with the white film of adhering powder. Gigantic and hideous claws that seemed to reach out of empty air, the side of a huge, scaly body, a yawning, dripping jaw. For a moment, Thad could see great hooked fangs in that jaw. Then they vanished, as if an unseen tongue had licked the powder from them, dissolving it in fluids which made it invisible. That unearthly, half-seen shape leaped at him. He was carried backwards into the room, hurled to the floor. Claws were rasping upon the tough fabric of his suit. His arm was seized crushingly in half-visible jaws. Desperately, he clung to the welding tool. The heated electrode was driven toward his body. He fought to keep it away. He knew that it would burn through even the insulated fabric of his suit. A claw ripped savagely at his side. He heard the sharp, rending sound as the tough fabric of his suit was torn, and felt a thin pencil of pain drawn along his body where a claw cut his skin. Suddenly the suit was full of the earthy fetor of the monster's body, nauseatingly intense. Thad gasped, tried to hold his breath, and thrust upward hard with the incandescent electrode. He felt warm blood trickling from the wound. A numbing blow struck his arm. The welding tool was carried from his hand. Flung to the side of the room, it clattered to the floor, and then a heavy weight came upon his chest, forcing the breath from his lungs. The monster stood upon his body and clawed at him. Thad squirmed furiously. He kicked out with his feet, encountering a great, hard body. Futilely he beat and thrust with his arms against the pillar-like limb. His body was being mauled, bruised beneath the thick fabric. He heard it tear again, along his right thigh. But he felt no pain and thought the claws had not reached the skin. It was the yellow dog that gave him the chance to recover the weapon. The animal had been running back and forth in the opposite end of the room, fairly howling in excitement and terror. Now, with the mad courage of desperation, it leaped recklessly at the monster. A mighty, dimly seen claw caught it, hurled it back across the room. It lay still, broken, whimpering. For a moment the thing had lifted its weight from Thad's body, and Thad slipped quickly from beneath it, flung himself across the room, snatched up the welding tool. In an instant the creature was upon him again, but he met it with the incandescent electrode. He was crouched in a corner now where it could come at him from only one direction. Its claws still slashed at him ferociously, but he was able to cling to the weapon and meet each onslaught with hot metal. Gradually its mad attacks weakened. Then one of his blind, thrusting blows seemed to burn into a vital organ. A terrible, choking, strangling sound came from the air, and he heard the thrashing struggles of wild convulsions. At last all was quiet. He prodded the thing again and again with the hot electrode, and it did not move. It was dead. The creature's body was so heavy that Thad had to return to the bridge and shut off the current in the gravity plates along the keel before he could move it. He dragged it to the lock through which he had entered the flyer and consigned it to space. 5 days later, Thad brought the Red Dragon into the atmosphere of Mars. A puzzled pilot came aboard in response to his signals and docked the flyer safely at Helion. Thad went down into the hold again with the astonished port authorities who had come aboard to inspect the vessel. Again, he passed among the grotesque and outrageous monsters in the hold, leading the gasping officers. While they marveled at the treasure, he lifted the weirdly embellished lid of the coffer of white crystal and looked once more upon the still form of the girl within it. Pity stirred him. An ache came to his throat. Linda Cross, so quiet and cold and white and yet so lovely. How terrible her last days of life must have been, with doom shadowing the vessel and the men vanishing mysteriously one by one. Terrible until she had sought the security of death. Strangely, Thad felt no great elation at the thought that half the incalculable treasure about him was now safely his own as the award of Salvage. If only the girl was still living. He felt a poignantly keen desire to hear her voice. Thad found the note when they started to lift her from the chest. A hasty scrawl, it lay beneath her head among glittering gems. This woman is not dead. Please have her given skilled medical attention as soon as possible. She lies in a state of suspended animation, induced by the injection of 50 minims of zeronel. She is my daughter, Linda Cross, and my sole heir. I entreat the finders of this to have care given her, and to keep in trust for her such part of the treasure on this ship as may remain after the payment of salvage or other claims. Sometime she will wake. Perhaps in a year, perhaps in 100. The purity of my drugs is uncertain, and the injection was made hastily, so I do not know the exact time that must elapse. If this is found, it will be because the lurking thing upon the ship has destroyed me and all my men. Please do not fail me. Levington Cross. Thad bought the white tower of his dreams, slim and graceful in its Martian garden of saffron and purple, among the low ochre hills beside Helion. He carried the sleeping girl through the silver door where the girl of his dreams had waited, and set the coffer in a great vaulted chamber. Many times each day he came into the room where she lay, to look upon her pallid face and feel her cold wrist. He kept a nurse in attendance and had a physician called daily. A long Martian year went by. Looking in his mirror one day, Thad saw little wrinkles about his eyes. He realized that the nervous strain and anxiety of waiting was aging him, and it might be 100 years, he remembered, before Linda Cross came from beneath the drug's influence. He wondered if he should grow old and infirm, while Linda lay young and beautiful and unchanged in her sleep. If she might awake after long years and see him only a feeble old man. And he knew that he would not be sorry he had waited, even if he should die before she revived. On the next day, the nurse called him into the room where Linda lay. He was bending over her when she opened her eyes. They were blue, glorious. A long time she looked up at him, first in fearful wonder, then with confidence and dawning understanding. And at last she smiled. End of Salvage in Space. End of 3 science fiction stories by Jack Williamson. These stories were recorded by Phil Chenevert. Hope you enjoyed them.